Chaps, welcome back to SJMMA. Now today, we're looking forward into 2025 as I'm going to give you fighters from each weight class who you should watch in the new year. Let's get straight into it. I shall be giving you one fighter from every weight class who is ranked and another one who is unranked that you should be keeping your eye on for potentially a very, very good 2025. And we'll start with the big dogs, and the ranked fighter that I'm going to talk about is Mick Parkin. Mick Parkin is quite an interesting heavyweight because a lot of the guys, especially at the top of the weight class, are very much explosive individuals. Mick Parkin is quite unathletic for a mixed martial artist. That's not meant to be an insult, it's just the way bodies work. But technically, he's very, very good. Of course, he trains out of the Aspinall, basically all heavyweight gym up in the north of England, which I think, especially in Europe, maybe even across the planet, if you're a heavyweight, one of the best places that you can possibly be. Because it's harder to find sparring partners as a bigger guy, especially in the UK. I mean, Aspinall had a really hard time finding fights, never mind people to actually bloody train with. Now, the offset of being technically good but not as explosive at heavyweight is if you come up against an explosive individual who also has a level of technique, you could be in trouble. But I think where Mick Parkin is in the division, I think a Tai Tuivasa fight makes sense. And as much as I would say that Tai is quicker than Mick Parkin, I could see him winning that fight. I think where Mick would start maybe to struggle in the weight class is when he gets into the Gelton Almeidas, because Almeida is very, very good at closing distance. Mick Parkin may get caught out by somebody like that, but for now, expect a good start with a ranked win at the start of 25 for Mick Parkin. And for the unranked, it's a guy who's new to heavyweight, a former light heavyweight in the UFC, Mr. Kennedy Azachukwu. I hope I got that bloody right. But, okay, he was okay at £205. His best win by far, which has aged brilliantly, was Carlos Ulberg. But I think the move up to heavyweight suits him a lot. I can't stress to you enough the natural skill gap between a light heavyweight and a heavyweight is massive. You have to be more technical the smaller you get. I think already he is big enough for the weight class, but over time, not having to cut down to light heavyweight anymore, he's only going to grow into that frame even more. He's already had his heavyweight debut against Chris Barnett, who did the most Chris Barnett thing ever by injuring himself during a backflip while being introduced in the cage, before the fight even started. I mean, you gotta love Mr. Chris Barnett, but that is just that's some A-grade shithousery on himself. But either way, he's turned right back around as old Kennedy, and he's fighting this Saturday night against Lucas Brzeski, I believe it is, a guy who was recently beaten by Mick Parkin, interestingly enough. I don't think Brzeski will be a problem for him, to be honest. The heavyweight division is so thin, as we know, that if he looks good against Lucas Brzeski, I could see him maybe fighting a Jairzinho Rozenstruik if he loses against Pavlovich in February. That's how thin the division is. It's also how much I rate Kennedy's chances of being good at heavyweight. So yeah, definitely watch out for the Nigerian Savage, 100%. Next up, light heavyweight, and the ranked fighter I'm going to talk about is Mr. Bogdan Guskov. Now, he made his debut in France last year, lost against Oezdemir, but has won two since then with 2 knockouts, the most recent one against Ryan Spann, who is a perennial ranked light heavyweight, so a very, very good win. He is now scheduled to fight Johnny Walker in January at UFC 311, which is shaping up as a great card if you've seen recent reports. And he goes in as a favourite against Walker in my eyes, because as much as I think Walker is a very, very good mixed martial artist and he's very dangerous in his own right, he gets finished too much. And Guskov's a finisher. If he can beat Johnny Walker, he's top 10 ranked. And at that point, he could look at maybe a rematch with Volkan Oezdemir, who also has beaten Johnny Walker, but recently lost a relatively close fight against Ulberg in Macau. I'm sure he'd love to get that win back, or he could draw into a Nikita Krylov kind of fight. And he could end next year as a top 5 light heavyweight. He really could. I think he's that good. So watch out for him. And the unranked light heavyweight that I think you should be looking at is the Chinese superpower, that is Mingying Zhang. Now, obviously, his most recent fight also came on the Macau card. He knocked out Ozzy Diaz, looked very, very good. He's very young in his career as an MMA fighter, especially in the UFC. So he's not even in his prime yet, do you know what I mean? He's an interesting guy to watch, Zhang, because he looks quite flat-footed and slow a lot of the time, but his ability to find the shot and his selection of shot is really, really good. I think he's in a similar spot to maybe like a Mick Parkin, where I think the bottom-ranked light heavyweights he could quite, not easily beat, but I think he's got a real shot. But there is a level in that division, only based off his current form, that I think he would have real issues with. But because he's so young into his elite level MMA career, he's going to level up very quickly, and he could be right on the verges or even in the rankings by the end of 2025. At 185, I think the ranked contender who can make massive moves in the new year is Anthony Fluffy Hernandez. Now, if you are one of these individuals who likes the violence of MMA, who loves a fantastic all-action stand-up brawl, you're probably not going to enjoy watching Hernandez fight. But as a guy who can appreciate the quality of his work from a stylistic and a technical standpoint, I think he's absolutely brilliant. And he's quite a rare fighter at his weight class. If you go above welterweight, there aren't many people who can hold down a ranked fighter and completely dominate them on the ground over 25 minutes. That's rare the further up the weight classes you get, which is exactly what he did to Michel Pereira very, very recently in a Fight Night main event. Now, he's already got a fight booked. He's fighting on February the 22nd against Brendan Allen in Seattle. Now, I don't know if that's going to be main event or not. If it's over 5 rounds, I think it gives Fluffy more of an advantage. There are some fantastic grapplers at 185 pounds. Obviously, Hamzat is probably the gold standard there, but his style of grappling is very different to Anthony Hernandez. He's the only guy, I think, in that division who could hold a guy down over 5 rounds. His ability to control from the top is excellent. He could very easily be going into 2026 with a title fight in the works. If he can beat Allen and then beat a Sean Strickland maybe, or even a Robert Whittaker and look impressive, he could be staring down the barrel of a UFC title fight as early as the start of 26. I'm really impressed with how he's evolved over the last few years as well. So yeah, definitely watch out for Fluffy in 2025. And the unranked 185er that I think everybody should be looking at in 2025 is Robocop, Mr. Gregory Rodriguez. Now, if you go back a few years, I would have easily had him in this video then as well. However, he's had a couple of setbacks. He lost by knockout against, I think it was Bruno Ferreira in Brazil, and he lost a split decision to Petrosian, I think it was. But he's won his last 3. Most recently, he went to Manchester and fought our very own CLD at UFC 304 and looked very good. And if you believe reports, there is potentially a fight in the works with him and Jared Cannonier, who is number 7 in the division, I believe, maybe number 8, but he has been on a bit of a skid as of recently. I don't think that's the right fight for Robocop. I think it's a bit of a step too far, too quick, but I think the perfect fight for him, I think, is Paulo Costa. Those two are quite similar in a lot of ways. They're very big, they're very muscular and aggressive fighters. I think Robocop's more aggressive, hits harder, and would actually knock out Paulo Costa. I think he'd do a job on Cannonier, to be honest, but in terms of how it fits in the division, I think it's a step too far. But yeah, honestly, I think the best version of him that we saw is his most recent outing, so I think he's very likely to take that into 2025 and beyond. So yeah, watch out for Robocop. We're going to stay with the Brazilians and we're going to move down to 170 and we're going to start with the rank guy that you need to have your eyes on, Mr. Carlos Prates. Now, I've spoke about Carlos a little bit recently, especially after his win over Neil Magny not too long ago. I'm a guy that comes from boxing stock, okay? I've been watching and also partaking in boxing for a very large actually chunk of my life, and if I see a southpaw, especially I'm left-handed, who has tremendous composed, poised boxing in the UFC octagon, I'm always going to be a fan. Why do you think I like Poirier so much? Do you know what I mean? I have mentioned this in the past about old Carlos. The fact that he is so good at keeping his balance and his feet underneath him and very good at selecting his shots at the right times is superb. It makes it very difficult for any striker to try and counter you and for any grappler to try and find an entry. It's an art form in itself, it really is. I like the fact he called out Jeff Neal. I wouldn't mind seeing that next, but there are others. I know that he's on a bit of a losing streak, but I think a Fight Night main event in his homeland against another Brazilian Gilbert Burns would be brilliant. Anybody around that kind of edge of the top 10, just inside, is perfect for Prates. I'm very, very high on him, and I genuinely believe he could be a title threat, especially this time next year. If he can get a couple of good wins, he can be right up in that top 5. We're going to move on, and we're going to serve some justice to Carlos Leal, because that decision, the loss at UFC 308, was disgusting. He beat the piss out of Renat over 3 rounds. One of the worst cards I've ever seen. Another southpaw welterweight, he was using that rear left body kick brilliantly in his last fight. And it was really doing damage on Renat as well. He's got decent boxing, he hits relatively hard. I think he's a very good welterweight. Maybe Jake Matthews or maybe a Brahami. Just kind of see where he is in the division. He deserves a fight against a good guy because he beat Renat and we all know it. So watch out for Carlos Leal because he could be a danger. Let's move on into the lightweights, and I think probably the most well-known guy in this video is Mr. Renato Moicano, but I think he's going to have a massive 2025. I've been so impressed with the evolution, especially as of recently. He was brilliant in France against BSD. He was brilliant at UFC 300 against Jalen Turner. He really has kind of grown into his body after moving up from featherweight to lightweight. He's looking as good as ever. It is looking increasingly likely that he will start next year with a fight against our very own Mr. Paddy the Baddy. I think he beats him convincingly. I always fancied him to beat Paddy, but especially based off recent form and performances, I think he's got Paddy on lock. If he can beat Paddy, honestly, I'm looking at Justin Gaethje, I'm looking at Dan Hooker, I'm looking at Max Holloway maybe for a BMF belt. Who wouldn't want to see that, right? He's already a name. He's made himself into a name recently. I think that this time next year he'll be even bigger. And he'll be a top 5 lightweight, very close on a UFC title shot. 100%. I'm very high on Moicano. I think next year really could be his year to take it to the next level. And the unranked lightweight that you guys should be looking out for in 2025 is the Frenchman, Mr. Felez Ziam. He's coming off his best win of his entire career, a brilliant knee knockout over a Frivola in France in September on the Moicano BSD card. When you have that natural height and reach like he does, it's so important that those guys use it and understand how much of an advantage it is and mould their game around it. I think Volkov is the perfect example of that across all MMA. So good at using the fact he's 6'7". I think Ziam's starting now to almost kind of gain the composure both in the pocket and at range to be able to use that reach. And if he can use it effectively, it's a real weapon at lightweight, it really is. Relatively recently, I did a matchmaking UFC prospects video and I put him in there with Jalen Turner, and I'm going to stick with that. I know it kind of negates his reach because in Jalen it's another tall guy, but if you can do that to Matt, who is so tough as we know, got great gym around him in New York with Sarah Longo, that's impressive. And I think recently Jalen Turner has been anything but impressive. Since his knockout of Green, he's been shite, basically. It looked like the French lightweight who was going to take over the weight class and really help to put the whole nation on the map in MMA was going to be Saint-Denis. He's faltered. Let's see if Ziam is the man. And I think he could be. Moving down to 145, I mean, I'm a Brit. It's quite obvious where I'm going to go. It has to be Lerone Murphy. Undefeated Lerone Murphy. Recently beat, obviously, Dan Ige at UFC 308. You could definitely see that it was a step up in class. And Ige is no mug. Ige is a superb fighter, very dangerous fighter. I think his next fight is very, very important. Because he's relatively young in his MMA game. I know he's not young on the age side of things, but he's not taken that much damage. There's not too many miles on his clock. He could probably take a risk up the rankings, and I think Arnold Allen against Lerone Murphy as the co-main event of the upcoming UFC London card in March would be absolutely barnstorming, right? One thing I love about UK MMA at the moment is we've always produced superb strikers. We've always had legendary boxers. We've got great kickboxers in this country, but recently, over the last few years, we've seen a lot of great all-round mixed martial artists and even guys who are kind of more grappling based who have done really, really well in the sport at the top level. I think Lerone is one of the most well-rounded guys we've got as well. We've not seen a high-level, high-stakes UFC UK versus UK matchup, I don't think ever, especially not in the modern era. There were rumblings about the idea of Leon Edwards and Darren Till. That never happened, but Arnold Allen against Lerone Murphy would be absolutely brilliant. I think it makes sense in the division as well, to be honest. And then it has to be Gene Silver as the unranked guy. I mean, them fighting nerds. I mean, it started off as a bit of a meme, but those guys are really starting to build some steam. You got Gene Silver, you got Cal Barajo, you got Carlos Pilates. Those guys mean business. Gene Silver knocked out Charles Jourdain, thought, do you know what? Where is that weird guy with the big chin at 155? I'll have him as well. Drew Dober. Bang. Completely bludgeoned him, doctor stoppage. Great performance. He is a featherweight, though, and he's got a new fight booked against a guy who I do know he's a great fighter. Not going to try and pronounce his name because I'll get it wrong. Right? He's fighting him. I don't agree with that. I think the right matchup for him was Calvin Kattar. I made that again in my... But yeah, if he can get past old matey, again, not going to try and say his name. I don't want to make a tit of myself. I think he does get the win there, and then he can fight somebody sort of on the verge of the top 10, like Calvin Kattar. And he could end next year as a top 10 UFC featherweight. And he could be a fight or two away from the belt. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I'm very high on Gene Silver. High on the fighting nerds in general, but yeah. Watch out for Lord. I was so impressed with Marcus McGee in his last fight where he beat the ranked contender of Mr. Jonathan Martinez at UFC 309. I know he had a good start in the UFC. I remember his fight against JP Bays with that right hook was superb. But I wasn't convinced he could step up into the level of Martinez and beat him. He did. Relatively soundly as well. He seems to have an immense kind of physicality for a bantamweight. And I'm looking at the likes of Song Yadong and maybe even Marlon Vera, maybe. And I'm thinking, I don't mind Marcus McGee in with those guys. He mainly won in between a fight with someone like Vera. But to be honest, if UFC announced a Fight Night Apex main event of those two, I'd watch it, man. Keep an eye on Marcus McGee because he is a finisher as well. And then the unranked guy has to be Mr. Farid Basharat. He's beaten Taylor Lapidus. He's beaten a Damon Blackshear. He had that weird kind of weight miss, sort of late notice featherweight with Victor Hugo, and he still took care of business really, really impressively. I think he could go all the way, man. I really do. Obviously, Afghan-born, raised in the UK, and he does work out of Extreme Couture now. That's a really, really good place to be as a smaller guy. I mean, I'm not sure I particularly want to be sparring Sean Strickland if I'm a bantamweight because he might kill me. But yeah, it's a great place to really kind of hone your skills. He's in good hands. He is more of a grappler than a striker, but he is relatively well. He is more of a grappler than a striker, but he's relatively well-rounded as well. He's a step behind somebody like Marcus McGee, so he would need a Jonathan Martinez style of fight. Kind of like the one Marcus had, if you know what I mean. Would not surprise me at all if we see a number across from the name of Farid Basharat come the end of 2025. It wouldn't surprise me even if it was a single-digit number as well, I'll be real. Moving into the flyweights, Asu Almabayev is who I'm going to pick as the ranked guy. I think he's number 7, number 8 in the world already at the moment. He's undefeated in the UFC. He's been undefeated in general for over 7 years now, and his most recent win against Mateusz Nicolau is a very, very good win. Very, very impressive. And because of the way that Alejandro Pantoja is cleaning out the 125-pound weight class, if he can beat Asakura on Saturday and then probably win a rematch with Royval, there we go. If Almabayev can get a win over a decent guy in between, maybe a Kai Kara France or a Brandon Moreno, he could set himself up for a title fight in the next 12-14 months, 100%. So keep an eye on him. Not the most exciting fighter in the world, but flyweights don't tend to be, but yeah, he's technically brilliant. And then finally, an unranked 125er to look out for is Mr. Clayton Carpenter. He's 8-0, he's only 28, and he's 2-0 in the UFC with 2 submissions. I can't really hype up flyweights that much, because I know a lot of you guys really couldn't give a fuck about them, to be fair, which I think is a shame. But yeah, if you want a flyweighter to really sort of like root for him back over the next year and almost kind of watch him grow, I'd go with Clayton for that, 100%. Right, chaps, that will just about wrap us up as we look forward at the guys that I think are going to have big years in 2025. Now, I tried to be somewhat out of the box. I mean, I could have easily said like Shara Bullet or like Peyton Talbot, you know, or like Bo Nickel, obviously, but I thought I'd be a little bit more kind of discreet and hand maybe some of you guys who don't watch the sport as much as some new names to look out for. So that was the plan for the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any thoughts, let me know, and yeah, I'll see you very soon, and take care.